The wind changed in the spring of 1968. Not suddenly, not in a way anyone could point to and say, "That's when it began." It happened quietly. A stand of trees gone here. Another one there. The sound of chainsaws in the distance. Morning to afternoon. Then silence where shade used to be. Across northern Nebraska, something was shifting. Not just the land. The way people thought about it. Land that didn't produce. Was land being wasted. And trees weren't assets anymore. They were obstacles. Caleb Whitaker stood at the edge of his woodlot, one hand resting against the rough bark of an old cottonwood. He had stood there many times before. But that morning felt different. The wind moved through the canopy above him. Slow, steady, carrying a low, constant sound, almost like breathing. Across the dirt road, a neighbor's trees were coming down. He could hear the saw, then the crack, then the long, heavy fall. Caleb didn't turn to look. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what it looked like. He knew exactly what it meant. 280 acres of farmland stretched behind him, and 25 acres of trees that everyone said were costing him money. 3 weeks earlier, he had stood inside the equipment dealership in Broken Bow. Clean floors, bright lights, new machines lined up in perfect rows. Everything about that place felt certain. Efficient, modern, and right in the middle of it, he had been told something that would follow him for years. You can't farm trees. The man who said it was Harold Jensen, owner of the International Harvester dealership, a man who sold tractors, planters, combines, and certainty. Trees don't pay your bills. He had said it casually, like it didn't even need to be argued. An acre of open ground grows corn. An acre of trees grows nothing you can sell every year. Caleb didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands, calloused, cracked in places where the skin never fully healed. Hands that had fixed engines, pulled fence wire, carried seed. Then he looked back up. What about the wind? Harold frowned slightly. The wind? The trees break it. A small laugh. Not loud, but enough to draw attention. You don't need trees to break wind, Harold said. You need better equipment so you can work faster. He gestured toward a new tractor behind him. If you clear that woodlot, you gain 25 acres. 25 acres pays for a machine like that in a few years. Caleb followed the motion, looked at the tractor, then back at Harold. I don't need more acres. You need profit. I need my land to still be here in 20 years. That answer didn't fit the room, didn't fit the numbers, didn't fit the way anyone else there understood farming. A man behind him let out a quiet chuckle. You really keeping those trees? Caleb nodded. I am. The laughter spread. Not loud. Be called cruelty. Just enough to mark him. Different. Outdated. Wrong. Caleb didn't argue. Didn't defend himself. He just turned and walked out. Left the clean floors. The bright lights. The rows of machines that promised more. If you were willing to owe more. Behind him, Harold said something to one of his workers. Caleb didn't catch all of it. Just one word. Old-fashioned. Over the next 2 years, the trees disappeared. Field by field. Fence line by fence line. The county opened up. Wide. Unbroken. Efficient. Every acre working. Every acre producing. On paper, it looked better. More bushels. More revenue. More progress. But Caleb's trees stayed. Every oak. Every cottonwood. Every line of shelter that had stood longer than most of the farms around it. And that's when the real story began. The trees stayed, not because it was easy, Not because Caleb didn't understand what everyone else was doing, but because he had spent too many years watching his land to believe the numbers on paper told the whole story. Farming, to most people, was acres and output, bushels per acre, dollars per season. Simple, clean, measurable. But Caleb had learned something different. Not from books, not from bulletins, from standing at his window, year after year, watching what actually happened. In winter, the trees caught snow. Not all of it, just enough. The wind would push across the open ground, carrying snow with it, until it met the woodlot. And there, it slowed, dropped, built into drifts along the southern edge. By March, those drifts melted slowly, not all at once, not like the exposed fields. They soaked in, deep, right when the soil needed it most. Caleb's north field always started the season with more moisture. He didn't measure it. He didn't need to. He could see it in the way the soil held together, when everything else started to dry. In spring, the wind came harder. Northwest, consistent, relentless. It moved across the county like it owned the place. And in most fields, it did. It lifted soil, carried it, moved it grain by grain, from one field to another. Slow damage, invisible at first, permanent over time. But not on Caleb's land. The trees took the force. The wind hit the canopy, broke apart, slowed, changed direction. By the time it reached his field, it wasn't the same wind anymore. His soil stayed, his rows held, while other fields began to show pale streaks, places where the dark top layer had simply disappeared. In summer, something else happened, something harder to see, harder to explain. His crops didn't get hit the same way, not by insects, not by the small, constant damage that most farmers accepted as part of the season. Earworms, aphids, leaf damage that never fully showed up in yield reports, but always took something. Caleb noticed the difference, not in numbers, in patterns. There were more birds along his tree line, more movement, more life at the edge of the field, and fewer problems inside it. He didn't know about parasitic wasps, didn't know about beneficial insects, didn't know the terms, but he knew the result. His crops held better, consistently, year after year. In fall, the trees gave something back again. Leaves, thousands of them, blown across the edge of the field, left there, ignored by everyone else. They broke down over winter, turned into something darker, something richer, something that made the soil feel different when you held it in your hand. The kind of difference you can't see from the road. Snow catch, wind protection, pest control, organic matter. 4 things. None of them counted. None of them priced. Them written down in any report Caleb had ever seen. But all of them, real. His wife, Ruth, sat at the kitchen table one evening with him. Ledger open, pencil in hand. "Harold says you're losing money," she said. 25 acres. 70 bushels per acre. She tapped the page lightly. "That's not nothing." Caleb nodded once. "I know. Then why keep them?" He looked out the window, toward the trees, standing dark against the fading light. "Because they're doing more than corn ever will. That's not what anyone else says. Most people don't watch long enough." The talk started soon after. Not loud, not direct, but constant. At the co-op, at the elevator, in the way conversations paused when he walked in, then picked back up when he passed. "He still got those trees." "Yeah. When's he cutting them?" "When he figures out he's losing money." A small laugh, a shake of the head. It became a kind of joke. Something easy. Something everyone agreed on without needing to think too hard about it. Being wrong is comfortable. When everyone else is wrong with you. By 1970, most of the woodlots in the county were gone, cleared, burned, pushed into piles, and turned into ash. The land opened up, wide, unbroken, efficient. From the road, it looked like progress. More acres, more rows, more production. But from where Caleb stood, at the edge of his trees, watching the wind move across the open fields, something else was beginning. Something slower. Something no one had numbers for yet. The soil was starting to move. Not all at once. Not like a storm. Just a steady drift. Day after day. Week after week. And nobody was paying attention. Not yet. It didn't happen all at once. No one woke up one morning and said something was wrong. There was no single storm. No single failure. Just small changes, spread out over years, easy to ignore if you weren't looking closely. By 1972, the soil had started to tell the story. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly, if you knew how to see it. Fields that had been cleared just a few years earlier began to change color. Not everywhere, not evenly, but in patches, along fence lines, across slight rises in the land. The dark topsoil, the layer that held moisture, life, and structure, was thinning. In some places, it was already gone. What remained underneath was lighter, drier, less willing to hold anything. Farmers noticed. Of course they did, but not in a way that changed anything. They talked about it. At the co-op, at the elevator. In passing. Bit of wind this year. Ground's lighter than it used to be. Probably just the weather. There's always a reason, when you don't want to change what you're doing. The county office noticed too. Reports came in. Measurements were taken, numbers written down. Filed away. Normal surface movement. That's what they called it. Expected on newly cleared land. Give it time. It would stabilize. It didn't. By 1974, the problem had a pattern. Fields without trees, lost more soil. Fields that had been cleared longer, lost even more. It wasn't catastrophic. Not yet. No dust clouds. No headlines. Just a slow erosion, measured in tons per acre per year. 3, sometimes 4. Enough to ignore in a season. Impossible to ignore over a decade. The wells began to change next. Not in every field, not all at once. But steadily. Quietly. Farmers who depended on shallow wells, 20, 30 feet down, started noticing the difference. Water levels dropping. A foot, sometimes more. Not enough to panic. Just enough to notice. The explanation was never clear. Too many variables. Too many assumptions. But the result was the same, less water. Less resilience. Less margin when things went wrong. Caleb's wells didn't change. Not in any way he could see. The water stayed where it had always been, reliable, steady. He didn't think much about it. Not at first. He had work to do. Always work to do. But he noticed something else. Something harder to explain, something that didn't show up in reports. His land didn't feel the same as everyone else's anymore. Not better. Not in a way you could prove with numbers. Just different. More stable. The soil held together when he walked it, held moisture longer after a dry stretch. Recovered faster after wind. He could see it in the crops. Not in dramatic yields. Not yet. But in consistency. In the way his fields didn't swing as hard between good years and bad ones. Sea is quiet. It doesn't get talked about. It doesn't draw attention. But over time, it becomes everything. By the mid-1970s, the gap started to widen. Slowly. Then a little faster. Fields that had once produced the same, no longer did. Some held. Some didn't. And no one could fully explain why. Except Caleb. Had an idea. Not a theory. Not a model. just an understanding built from watching. He knew what had changed, and what hadn't. The trees were still there, still breaking the wind, still catching snow, still holding moisture, still feeding something beneath the surface that no one else was counting. He never said it out loud. Not at the co-op. Not at the elevator. There was no point. People don't hear things that don't fit what they already believe. But every evening, he walked the same path, through the woodlot, up along the ridge, between trees that had been there longer than his family. The ground was different there. Softer, deeper, covered in years of fallen leaves, slowly turning into soil, building something no one else was building anymore. He knew every tree, not by name, by memory, by shape, by where it stood, and how it had changed. A red oak on the slope that had taken a lightning strike years ago. Still standing, still growing. A cottonwood knew the edge that leaned slightly into the wind, never breaking. He didn't think of the woodlot as separate from the farm. It wasn't extra. It wasn't unused. It was part of the system, the part no one else seemed to understand. And while the rest of the county chased more acres, more output, more immediate return, Caleb Whitaker kept doing the same thing. Watching, waiting, working, and letting time do what it always does. Turn small differences into something no one can ignore anymore. The summer of 1977 didn't arrive with warning. Not the kind people recognize. No storms. No sudden heat wave that made headlines. Just less rain. Week after week. Clouds that formed, then disappeared. Fields that waited, and didn't get what they needed. At first, no one worried. Dry spells happened. They always had. Farmers knew how to wait. Until waiting stopped working. By June, the soil had already begun to give up what little moisture it held. By July, it was clear. This wasn't just a dry year. This was the kind of season that exposed everything. Every weakness. Every shortcut. Every decision made years earlier that no one thought would matter anymore. The cleared fields showed it first. Ground that had been opened up over the past decade. Fields that once held trees, now stretched wide and unprotected. The wind moved across them without resistance, pulled moisture from the soil, carried what little remained away. Corn that should have been waist-high by mid-July barely reached the knee. Leaves curled in on themselves, color fading from deep green to something lighter. Something tired. You could see it from the road. You didn't need numbers. You didn't need reports. You just needed to look. Caleb's fields didn't look the same. Not perfect. Not untouched. But holding. The corn stood taller. Leaves still open. Color deeper. Not because the rain had been different. It hadn't. Because the land underneath was different. The trees were still doing what they had always done. Breaking the wind before it reached the field. Holding moisture longer in the soil. Reducing the slow loss that no one noticed. Until it was too late. On the east side of his property, the fence line told the story better than any report ever could. On one side, Caleb's field. Dark soil. Standing crop. Wind slowed before it reached the rows. On the other, his neighbor's land, cleared years earlier, wide open, exposed. The difference wasn't subtle. It was immediate, undeniable. Two decisions, made years apart, meeting at a single fence. Don Mercer stood there one evening in late August, hat low, hands on his hips, looking across that line. On his side, stunted corn, pale ground, stalks bent from wind that never stopped moving. On Caleb's side, height, color, structure. Same county, same weather, same year, different outcome. Don didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. He just stood there longer than he meant to, then turned and walked back to his truck. Because sometimes the truth doesn't need words. Harvest came early that year, not by choice, by necessity. Fields that couldn't hold on were taken first. Combines moved faster, finished sooner. Bins filled less. Across the county, yields dropped. Not completely, but enough. Enough to be felt. Enough to hurt. Fields that had once pushed 70 bushels now struggled to reach 50. Some didn't. Caleb's fields came in later, September, like they always had. The crop held. Not a record, not something people would talk about in good years. But in that year, it was everything. 78 bushels. More than most. More than enough. The difference wasn't just yield. It was survival. For the first time, people stopped laughing. Not openly. Not all at once. But the tone changed. Questions replaced jokes. Glances replaced certainty. Doubt started to move. At the co-op, someone brought it up. Whitaker's fields held. A pause. Better than most. Another voice. He still got those trees. Silence. Yeah. A longer pause. No one laughed. Because now, it wasn't just about what the trees weren't producing. It was about what they had protected. Don Mercer didn't come to Caleb. Not that year. Not the next. But he didn't clear another acre either. The chainsaws slowed. Not everywhere. Not completely. But enough. Because something had changed. Not the weather. Not the land. The understanding. And for the first time in nearly a decade, the trees didn't look like wasted ground anymore. They looked like something else. Something people hadn't been counting. Something they hadn't known how to measure. Until it mattered. The drought ended. Not with relief. Not in any way that made up for what it had taken. It simply passed. Rain returned. Fields greened again. And slowly, people stopped talking about 1977. That's what most seasons do. They hurt. Then they fade. Unless something changes because of them. For most of the county, nothing did. The same fields stayed open. The same decisions stayed in place. The same assumptions carried forward. Because it's easier to move on than to admit you were wrong. But something had shifted beneath the surface. Not loudly, not publicly, just enough. In the spring of 1979, a man named Edward Klein drove into the county. He wasn't a farmer, didn't own land, didn't plan anything. He bought timber, hardwood, old growth, the kind that takes a lifetime to become valuable, and only a moment to disappear. He had been driving for 2 days, road after road, farm after farm, looking for something that used to be common, and finding almost nothing. Because it had already been cut. Woodlots gone. Stumps left behind. Burn piles turning into ash. The county had traded its trees for acres. Then he drove past Caleb Whitaker's farm. He slowed, then stopped, got out of the truck, closed the door without taking his eyes off the tree line. 30 acres. Still standing. Still intact. Still alive. He stood there for a long moment, not moving, just looking, like a man who had been searching for something, and finally found it. Edward walked the woodlot for hours, measured trunks, checked grain, looked up into the canopy, then down at the forest floor. Everything was right, straight growth, no major damage, no neglect. This wasn't luck, this had been kept. When he came back to the house, Caleb was sitting at the table, waiting, not eager, not curious, just present. Edward took off his hat. "You've got the finest stand of timber I've seen in this part of the state." Caleb nodded once. I figured it might be worth something. Edward gave a small breath. It is. How much? Edward hesitated. Not because he didn't know, because he knew exactly what the number meant. For a selective harvest. He paused again. About 180,000. The number didn't land all at once. It didn't need to. Caleb sat still, hands resting on the table, eyes steady. 20 years. 20 years of being told. Those trees were costing him money. 20 years of numbers that said he was losing 2,000, 3,000, every year. 20 years of laughter, of advice, of certainty from people who never once asked what the trees were actually doing. And now, the same trees were worth more than everything they had said he had lost. And they were still standing. Caleb didn't answer right away. He looked out the window, toward the woodlot. The same trees, the same wind moving through them, the same quiet work they had been doing, all along. I'm not selling all of it. Edward nodded. I wouldn't either. Selective harvest. Leave the rest. Caleb gave a small nod. That's what I was thinking. They shook hands. Not like businessmen. Not like men making a deal. Like men agreeing on something that had already been decided. The harvest happened the next year. Carefully, deliberately. Only part of the timber came down. The rest remained. Spaces opened. Light reached the ground, and within a few seasons, the woodlot filled itself back in. Nothing was lost. Everything continued. The wind still broke. The snow still gathered. The soil still held. And the land kept working. Word spread. Not fast, not loudly, but steadily. The same people who had once laughed, now spoke differently. Not with apologies. Not directly, but with hesitation. Harold Jensen drove out one evening, late, after most of the workday had passed. He found Caleb walking the edge of the woodlot, like he always did. They stood there for a while without speaking, wind moving through the trees, fields stretching out beyond them. I told people to cut, Harold said. Caleb nodded. You did. I said trees didn't matter. Another nod. You said that too. Harold looked out across the field, then back at the trees. How did you know? Caleb rested his hand against the bark beside him. Rough. Familiar. I didn't. I just watched. Harold let out a slow breath. I was looking at numbers. And I was looking at the land. Caleb glanced at him. You weren't wrong. Harold frowned slightly. I was. No. You were just looking at the wrong thing. Neither man said anything after that. They didn't need to. The answer was already there. In the trees. In the soil. In the difference you could see, without needing to measure it. Caleb Whitaker farmed that land for another decade. Not bigger. Not louder. Just. Steady. When he stepped away, he didn't leave behind the largest farm, or the newest equipment. He left something else. A system that worked. A piece of land that still held itself together. And the woodlot, that had outlasted every opinion ever thrown at it. Years later, when his son walked that same path through the trees, he saw what Caleb had seen. Not wasted ground. Not scenery. A farm that worked because the trees were part of it. Sometimes, the most valuable thing on a farm is the thing that doesn't produce a crop. Sometimes, the right decision looks wrong for a very long time. And sometimes, the man who refuses to cut is the only one who understands what cutting really costs. The county laughed for years. The trees stood for generations. And in the end, the trees were right.